I have foregone store-bought yeast for 5 years now since I started my sourdough journey, and I'm convinced that if you are willing to relearn this what is old is new way of making bread, you'll find that store-bought yeast is an unnecessary purchase in your own kitchen. Using only a sourdough starter as a rising agent, you can make brownies, cakes, muffins, biscuits, pizza dough, naan, and all manner of sweet and savory breads. If you followed the instructions in our last video and captured your own wild yeast, you too can declare similar bread independence. Now the best way to get to know your sourdough is to bake with it often. And there's no better reason to fire up the oven than to make a homemade loaf of real whole grain sourdough bread. You can find many recipes for making sourdough bread online, so I may as well offer our homestead super simple recipe to the mix. This is a straightforward bread recipe that I've developed over the years, and even though it only uses 4 ingredients, it produces a nourishing, delicious loaf that we make nearly every day during the winter. Since it doesn't have an overnight ferment, the resulting loaf is hardly sour and perfect for pretty much any use. It is 100% whole grain and will not make this exact same lacquer crust and spongy interior that you may expect from a commercial bakery's white sourdough, but you can't beat the flavor or nutrition. Here's the ingredients. 8 ounces recently fed starter, basically 1 cup. 3.5 cups whole wheat flour, increase it to 4 cups if you grind your own. Filtered water or non-chlorinated water, start with 1 cup, trust me you're gonna need more. 2 teaspoons of salt, cornmeal for dusting the baking surfaces. If you have the option to grind your own flour, I recommend grinding a combination of 3 parts organic hard red winter wheat to 1 part organic rye grain. This is my favorite combination for a hearty, flavorful, easy to knead, and excellently textured loaf. It's also a really good combination to feed your starter. Now here's some optional but helpful equipment. A cast iron cloche, a Danish dough whisk, a banneton with a linen liner, a pizza peel or a baking stone, and an instant read thermometer. Now here's what you need to do. Number 1, remove your starter from the fridge if you keep it in the fridge. The night before you bake, remove your starter from the fridge, reduce it, and feed it twice as much as you usually do. I like to have at least 2 or more cups of starter available when I begin a baking day. Step number 2, add flour to a bowl and slowly mix in some water. Put the flour in a large bowl and slowly mix in enough water to make the dough stick together without being sticky and wet. It is okay if it looks crumbly. Now allow that to rest for 20 minutes. Number 3, add salt and starter. Add the salt and starter and incorporate using your hand until the wet flour begins to merge with the starter. Once they're mixed well, allow it to rest for 10 more minutes. You can feed your starter in the meantime and put it back in its place. Step 4, knead the dough. Wet your hands with water and start to knead the dough in the bowl. Ideally, the dough should be pliable enough to work easily, but not so sticky and wet that it mushes and doesn't hold its shape. Allow the dough to rest for 5 minutes. Now don't be too frustrated if this stage is difficult for you. Learning the right consistency of dough during and after kneading is truly more an art than a science and is only best learned through experience. Now resist the urge to add too much flour. With whole grains, adding too much flour will result in a dense and crumbly, dry bread. Step 5, continue kneading into a round ball. Knead for about 3 more minutes with a wet hand. By this point, the dough should be smooth. Cover and allow it to rise in a warm place for 2 to 3 hours. Step number 6, punch the dough and allow it to rise again. Gently punch down the dough mass, shape it into a round shape. I'll put a link over here to a shaping tutorial that's ideal, and place it in a banneton lined with a flour-dusted linen cloth. If you don't have these traditional bread-raising baskets, a flour-dusted cloth napkin in a large mixing bowl can also work. Again, allow it to rise in a warm place for at least 3 hours. Step number 7, preheat the oven and prepare your baking surface. Preheat an oven to 450 degrees Fahrenheit. If you have a cast iron cloche, preheat it empty in the oven for about 25 minutes as the oven heats up. If you are using a cloche and also have a baking stone in your oven, make sure the baking stone is on a rack below your cloche, not in direct contact with it. If you're using a baking stone alone, place it on the second lowest rack in your oven. And if you don't have these things, just use a cookie sheet when it's time to put the bread in the oven. Step number 8, dust your cooking surface and prepare the loaf. Now carefully remove the hot cloche from the oven and dust the bottom of it with cornmeal. Or if you're using a pizza peel or a cookie sheet, dust that surface also with cornmeal. Turn the loaf onto the cornmeal and slash the top with a serrated knife to allow it to expand in the oven. Now cover with the cloche top if applicable, slide it onto a pizza peel if applicable, and place it in the oven for a full 15 minutes. Step number 9, reduce the heat and check your bread. Reduce the heat to 425 degrees, remove the cloche top and bake for 20 minutes longer. forever, or until the internal temperature of the loaf registers somewhere between 190 and 200 degrees Fahrenheit. A hollow sound produced by tapping the base of the loaf is the traditional method for testing doneness. Step number 10, allow your loaf to cool and enjoy. Allow the loaf to cool in a drying rack for 10 minutes before slicing and enjoy with lots of butter and homemade preserves. It should last for around 5 days wrapped in a cloth napkin, getting slightly more sour with every passing day, although to be honest, bread usually never lasts that long. Now, why use wild yeast instead of store-bought? When reading sourdough bread recipes online, you'll often see that both professionals and home bakers combine sourdough starter with store-bought yeast to make sure that the process works. This is not only unnecessary, it actually might hamper the success of your bread. Wild yeast and store-bought yeast are different materials entirely. Wild yeast is the common name for Saccharomyces exiguus, a naturally occurring yeast that varies fascinatingly by region. The starter that you're going to make for bread baking is technically called a leaven, which is a mixture of wild yeast and acid-producing, acid-tolerant bacteria. Those two organisms work together to ferment dough, produce the carbon dioxide bubbles that aerate and lift the loaf, and give that distinctive sour taste of sourdough. I love natural yeast because it's so specific to place. The starter I ferment in my Ozark kitchen will be different from the one you make in yours. You can't get much more locally harvested than that. By contrast, store-bought yeast is Saccharomyces cerevisiae. It was originally a product of the brewing industry, but has been selectively bred in laboratories since the 1840s to shortcut the long fermentation process in favor of quick gas production. Commercial yeast doesn't form a relationship with any bacteria, which is why bread that's made with it lacks that distinctive sourdough acidity. The rapid rise produced by lab-refined yeast might get you a loaf in record time, but many of the minerals and nutrients in wheat will remain in a form that is relatively inaccessible to the human body. Without the acidification of being cultured from a long fermenting rise, bread just won't offer you the same food value. When you understand the difference between the active bubbling culture in your jar and that packet of dried pale pellets that you get from the store, you'll finally be on your way to trusting your starter to let it raise your bread, muffins, and biscuits in its own merit. It may take longer, but it's worth it. And I want to share you some benefits of why. The long fermentation process used to make sourdough products doesn't just give it a complex flavor. It also does you the service of pre-digesting your food, making it far easier to benefit from the nutrition otherwise locked away in wheat. There is considerable evidence that those with sensitivity to gluten may benefit from long fermented sourdough products. Though they may not be able to eat wheat products made with quick rise yeasts, many gluten-sensitive individuals can eat organic sourdough leaven bakery without problems. Now, the health benefits notwithstanding, the difference in an eating experience between a store-bought, chemical-laden loaf of bread and a crusty, whole-grain sourdough loaf are nothing short of extraordinary. Now, if you're as absurdly passionate about real sourdough as I am, you'll not have any trouble finding a daily use for your sourdough starter. If you start falling into the deep end of bread independence, you may even find yourself grinding and blending your own flour. It really does make a difference. Geeking out over excellent books like The Bread Builders or anything by Peter Reinhardt, and upping the consistency of your baking game by learning baker's percentages. I challenge you to give it a try. Reclaiming bread independence is a delightful, healthy, and delicious endeavor.